These two monsters unalive this little girl, and the worst part is this could have been prevented because her abuse had been documented on 25 different occasions. It's February 25th, 2018, and first responders are alerted to a condo in Stockton Springs, Maine. Police are alerted to an unresponsive child, and when they arrive, it's very evident that she was already unalive. This little girl was actually identified as 10-year-old Marissa Kennedy. When investigators get to the scene, it's immediately evident that this child had been the victim of prolonged abuse, and an investigation is immediately opened. Now, according to the neighbors, they often heard sounds of arguments, and on the 24th of February, just the day before this child is found unresponsive, many neighbors hear a lot of commotion coming from inside the home before it suddenly stops around 4 p.m. the next day. They say things at the home were unnaturally silent. Marissa's cause of death was determined to be battered child syndrome, and she had multiple injuries, including a brain bleed, a lacerated liver, and many other old injuries. So investigators immediately arrest her mother, Sharon Carrillo, and her stepdad, Julio Carrillo. At this time, Marissa was living with her mother Sharon and her stepdad Julio at this condo that was actually owned by her grandparents. Marissa was not an only child. She actually had two other siblings who were aged 1 and 2 years old, and they were taken by the Maine Department of Health and Human Services after her parents were arrested. Also, apparently at the time of Marissa's death, her stepdad Julio had been in the process of attempting to adopt her. Now, this case takes a huge shift when investigators start digging into the case, and it's discovered that there were previous reports of abuse against 10-year-old Marissa Kennedy. For example, teachers and staff at Marissa's school raised concerns about her well-being, and they observed signs of distress and abuse, including frequent absences and physical injuries. Child Protective Services had actually been contacted on multiple occasions concerning Marissa's safety, and despite these reports, she still remained in the custody of Sharon and Julio. In fact, Marissa's abuse had been documented on at least 25 different occasions just 16 months before her death. That's a really short period of time for the amount of abuse that was going on, and still no one stepped in. Police even visited her home, but the abuse was not addressed, and she was sent to the hospital on several occasions with injuries that were suspicious enough to report. I want to put a trigger warning here because we're going to talk about the abuse that Marissa suffered, so if you don't want to listen to that, I'm going to give you a timestamp on the screen that you can skip forward to if you don't want to hear about it. Marissa had been forced to kneel on kitchen tiles and raise her hands above her head as she is repeatedly hit with a belt. 2 weeks before Marissa died, this belt was actually changed to a metal mop, and Marissa had been hit with such force that this mop had broken in half. If all of this wasn't awful enough, Marissa was also locked in a dark closet for hours as a form of punishment, where she would scream and cry for hours. There's one particular incident that happened just a few days before her death where Marissa tells her mom that she feels like she's dying, and shortly after she stops moving and her speech becomes slurred. Julio and Sharon don't get medical attention for this. They, in fact, think that she is just pretending, so they continue to abuse her. When Marissa passes away on the 25th of February, instead of taking accountability, Sharon and Julio come up with this plan. They stage the basement to look like Marissa had just fallen. They're actually the ones who call 911 and claim they found Marissa unresponsive in the basement beside the furnace, bleeding from her mouth, and they claim that Marissa was playing in the basement on her own for several hours, and when they go down to check on her, she just happened to be lifeless on the floor. Sharon and Julio actually stuck with this version of events for a while following their arrest, and Sharon tried to claim that Marissa was actually very violent and was abusing other members of the family, but this was not true. Investigators end up finding blood on and around a chair in the kitchen, behind a toilet, and even in Marissa's bed. That, coupled with all of the old injuries Marissa had, gave them enough information that they needed to know that this was not an accident. When they present this evidence to Sharon and Julio, they both admit they had just been physically disciplining Marissa, and then they finally break down and confess that they had been beating her and came up with this plan to basically cover up her death. Ultimately, Julio pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 55 years in prison, but as for Sharon, she pleaded not guilty, so she was ordered to stand trial. Her defense was that she had an extremely low IQ and was easily persuaded to give false statements to incriminate herself out of fear of Julio. Her defense was basically just going to put all of the blame on Julio. But remember, they're both willing participants in this. Sharon's defense also suggested that Sharon herself was the victim of abuse at the hands of Julio. Graphic photos were actually found on Julio's phone of Sharon and Marissa both kneeling nude on a tile floor with their hands up, but the jury ultimately rejected this defense and found Sharon Carrillo guilty of depraved indifference murder, and she was sentenced to 48 years in prison. This case is it's a really tough one because there's so many points in time where Marissa could have been saved from this. I don't know why no one stepped in. There's at least 25 different reports of her abuse, so there should have been some kind of interjection. But ultimately, the people that were supposed to love and care for her did the unthinkable, and now they will spend their lives in prison, hopefully for the remainder of their natural lives. Let me know what you guys think about this case down in the comments. As always, if there's a case you'd like me to cover, feel free to comment it down below. And thank you guys so much for your love and support. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.